Welcome to Socialist Salad. My name's Gilly. This is our first episode, so I really appreciate you checking it out. We're a show all about pop culture, late-stage capitalist neoliberalism, and Marxism. But I hope those of you who aren't politically minded stick around and listen to the socialist critique of the great work She-Ra and the Princesses of Power. With the new season of She-Ra out today, I thought I would add my thoughts on the series as a whole and how it relates to Marxist theory, liberalism, and fascism. She-Ra is a great show, and I'm not here to debate that. Instead, I want to talk about the show as a vehicle for left critique and how it advocates for revolutionary socialism. She-Ra's reboot has been reviled by many in the reactionary community, but they do not understand the depth of the socialist narrative present within the work that they critique, focusing on surface-level, vague values like She-Ra being woke or She-Ra isn't feminine enough. If they would only dive deeper, they would realize the extent of the critique the show has for fascist and neoliberal movements is more solid and overt than they had possibly imagined. In the first episode of our series on She-Ra and the Princesses of Power, we'll try to give a full overview of the first season of She-Ra and how each episode relates to socialism, fascism, and more. Let's dive in. Between the show's deep lore that informs the present narrative and the excellent conflict and drama between Adora and Catra, there's more than enough reasons for a casual fan to watch the series and enjoy it at a surface level. That's not to say the series is devoid of flaws. Plenty of episodes like Flowers for She-Ra come off unsatisfying, and conflict between man and machine is generally lackluster, despite being a frequently used element of the show. While I may make reference to my thoughts on the show as the video continues, I'd much rather focus on providing an interpretation of the episode that may conflict with the explicit message given to the audience by the narrative. Spoilers, by the way, so if you haven't seen She-Ra Season 1 yet, go check it out. It's neat. First, we have The Sword Part 1 and Part 2. One of the series' main strengths, especially during episodes that occur after Princess Prom, is the ability for the series to seamlessly transition between episodes. This is especially noticeable in two-part episodes, and every episode from Princess Prom to the season finale, The Battle of Bright Moon. Talking about episodes individually will become more difficult as the series continues, as each episode begins to blend into one another. But I'll do my best to keep my focus on the episodes and topics at hand. The Sword establishes the main characters of the series: Catra, Adora, Shadow Weaver, Bow, and Glimmer. Surprisingly enough, only 3 of these characters have their motivations and feelings fully explored by the end of Season 1. Many opportunities for development are ignored in favor of more screen time for Adora. This is one of the things I hope to see in Season 2. Nearly all of the side characters, with the exception of Entrapta, are largely left ignored, even by the narratives of their own episodes. The Sword also establishes the heel-face turn for Adora that forms the foundation of the series and the beginning of my suspicion that the writers might be closeted socialists, advocating for socialist values from the compromised position of children's programming. Adora begins the series as a lumpen proletarian, someone who has little to no class consciousness. Not only is she unaware of the atrocities her society, the Horde, commits, she gleefully swallows their narrative and is even in line to become one of the leaders, the bourgeoisie. In Marxist theory, the bourgeoisie are those that control nations and capital, not just the men at the top, but the middle managers along the way. After a mishap with Catra, Adora finds herself in contact with a sword that has the potential to change everything. In her bid to retrieve the sword, she comes into contact with Bow and Glimmer, and, after a failed confrontation with the revolutionary forces, ends up captured. It should be noted, at this point, that princesses are used in the narrative not to represent the bourgeoisie, as one might assume. Although the princesses do indeed hold power in revolutionary society, they are actually metaphors for another group entirely, millennials and zoomers, the youngest and current generation. While the princesses are de facto in charge, The context in which they are now responsible for the welfare of their kingdom is that their parents have left them smoldering rubble in a state that is failing both them and their people. In the Fright Zone, propaganda pits society in a princess versus society narrative, similar to the way capitalist media pins the problems of capitalism on millennials and Zoomers. In this way, we can draw clear parallels between the two groups. The turning point of the series comes when Adora, through the sword and her encounter with Glimmer, realizes that there is no difference between herself and her captors, Bow and Glimmer. It is at this point that Adora both discerns the presence of an upper class and a lower class and questions it, and by the end of the episode rejects the class system and seeks revolution. She attempts to explain what she's learned to Catra, who has become a member of the bourgeoisie, only to discover that Catra had always known the truth behind the propaganda, and that she was okay with the suppression of others so long as she was the one on top. Their friendship breaks here, although the echoes of their love for one another resonate even in late season episodes like Promise, but more on that later. In both this episode and the following episode, Raz, Adora's shift into a revolutionary is seen from the perspective of many different groups. Adora finds herself out of place because now the Horde shuns her. Her former in-group have taken her revolution personally. Her integration into left-wing circles has not been taken kindly either. Her history is critically analyzed, and even when radicalizing Swiftwind, the most explicit analog for a communist in the show, she does not come to an understanding with him. The only people who accept her as she is, even after considering her vitriolic history, are her new friends and an old woman named Raz, who helps her to better understand her new role in society and what she can do to channel her ideals in a positive direction. At the end of the episode, Adora submits herself to the Bright Moon community by showing her solidarity in a tangible manner and risking her life, literally handing Queen Angela her sword and sticking her neck out. This act earns their respect, and she is given an opportunity to prove herself, an opportunity that Adora takes with relish. Raz is arguably one of the weaker episodes in the series, but I have no real complaints with the portrayal of the leftist community as a bunch of gatekeeping snobs who infight with their allies. Not calling names, but infighting is basically the bread and butter of the socialist community, and even people on the right sides of the issue are regularly excluded from the discourse by less tolerant leftists. A more in-depth look at leftist infighting might occur in a later video, but rest assured, it happens frequently. The award for weakest episode by far, however, goes to Flowers for She-Ra. This episode is, in my opinion, the worst episode of Season 1, but it is also the episode that inspired me to make this video, and the episode that made me most strongly question what side the writers were on in the socialist debate. Ignoring how awkward the episode was and looking deeper into the motivations and plot, we uncover a surprisingly unique and genuinely heartfelt take on a movement oft maligned by the reactionary community. But first, we need to talk neoliberalism. This episode is not the first time we get to see and examine the antagonistic neoliberal nature of Queen Angela, and it certainly won't be the last. From the very beginning of the episode, Angela is intentionally shackling the movement of the revolutionary team and trying to prevent them from enacting socialist reforms, actually solving the problems that plague other kingdoms. In this particular case, Queen Angela forbids her daughter from providing military aid to a kingdom without a military and instead encourages humanitarian aid. Humanitarian aid is usually a tool capital uses to destroy the industry of third world countries by competing directly with existing businesses and offering products for free, raising the way for bigger, stronger corporations to move in. In Raz and the Sword, we also see Queen Angela's neoliberal attitude get in the way of important revolutionary developments. The recruiting of the powerful She-Ra in the defense of not one, but two forest villages, and her behavior seems to imply she cares more about maintaining her own power and keeping her daughter safe than she does the lives and welfare of her citizens. Angela is more than willing to let hundreds die and the economy fall into shambles than actually do something about the invasion encroaching on her border, the invasion being a metaphor for the creep of fascism into modern society. This is a plot point that will repeat itself numerous times in the future and will almost certainly recur in Season 2. For now, keep it in mind and we'll revisit it later in this video. When the party arrives at Plumeria's capital, they are surprised to find that an agricultural, peaceful country has been reduced to ashes and dirt. All around them the landscape is dying, and the horde is the one responsible for poisoning the environment. Unfortunately, Plumeria seems to have no idea who is the root cause of the issue plaguing them, instead choosing to defer to the army of the revolutionary team, who will certainly solve the problem. They pledge their capital to the revolutionaries, even as they themselves starve, because they see no other way they can help. This seems particularly relevant because Plumeria directly mirrors a real-world movement, the hippie movement of the 60s. There's a joke in the socialist community that goes, hippies are what happened when you have an ideology without a framework for class consciousness. The hippie movement is a whole topic I'd love to touch on in another video, but a quick summary is that it was an anti-war counterculture movement that had broad cultural support but little political impact on the UK and US communities that began it. The hippies had a strong cultural impact on the era, demonstrated through economic protests, music, and fashion, but their work was co-opted by neoliberal capitalism. While they correctly identified environmentalism as a problem and advocated for cooperative movements and against corporations, the way in which they proposed to tackle these problems, sing Kumbaya and buying albums from musicians, led to the movement having little to no impact on the political culture of the era. Why did the hippies struggle to succeed despite having broad cultural support at the time? They had won the culture war, it had seemed, but they did not take substantial political action, just like the Plumerians. Instead of embedding themselves in the government and sticking it to the man from within, they chose to stick it to the man by purchasing music and talking about peace with their friends. If the socialist and workers' movements had not been systematically dismantled by the Red Scare, they would have been able to show the hippies how to take tangible steps to change the world around them. But instead, they were buried by history and their advancements treated as a joke to society. She-Ra is one of the only audiovisual works in our time to actually provide critique to the hippies from the left, not the right or the center, and then provide a redemption arc for the off-maligned, good-intentioned group. The hippies were a movement that, if guided by the revolutionaries and not neoliberal capital, would have caused great change in the world. She-Ra tells them that they can make a difference in their society and provides a clear path to the Plumerians as to how they might accomplish peace, by fighting the horde and literally dismantling their factories and machines. Symbolism much? In doing so, the Plumerians are turned from the lumpen that they were into revolutionary agents who actually fight alongside the protagonists and restore the environment they had lost. This is a good ending that the real-world hippie movement never got to have, and it really shows how much the show cares about real issues and not just made-up fantasies of princesses and monsters. This theme of real issues caused by our parents' inadequate responses to the problems of neoliberalism is continued in the next episode, The Seagate. Putting aside the masculinity of Captain Seahawk, the joke is that he maintains his toxic masculinity in the face of people far more competent than him and literally ignores the world around himself. The real issue of the episode is the titular Seagate, a gate passed down from parent to daughter in a literal state of disrepair, ready to collapse at any moment and cause the death of thousands as the Horde army advances through the pass. The clear, real-world analogy between the crumbling infrastructure of the United States and the ghost town of Selenius is obvious. Princess Mermista is one of the more pessimistic characters of the series, and she sees no reason to fix her crumbling infrastructure. Her outlook is nihilistic, determining that nothing she can do will fix the Seagate, and the better solution is to wait for death and destruction, a sentiment aired by many teens and leftists in the real world. Many people have been black-pilled by the fascists, convinced to wait for and embrace death rather than enact real change in their lives. Even members of my own family are no exception. I often worry for one of my own family members because they have made strong indications of nihilism and self-hatred I can't bear to see them suffer through. But, like in the show, there is a solution to both these problems. She-Ra offers Mermista a new philosophy, one where Selenius doesn't have to fall, and one where her town can flourish again. She offers Mermista a bread pill, which she swallows with some hesitance but no coercion. A bread pill is the opposite of a black pill. It gives one hope and teaches about the class struggle and how we fight. Classical socialism doesn't have much to say about infrastructure, even though we love our trains and fascists often conflate using taxes to fund infrastructure with socialism. Progressive politics, however, do provide a road to improve infrastructure that socialism would totally be on board with. Publicly funded and publicly constructed infrastructure. The issue with funding more of our infrastructure with public funds is that the reactionaries would rather die than pay even a few dollars more in taxes, and neoliberals would like to see our bridges in the hands of corporations. Funny enough, in this metaphor, Princess Scorpia and Catra are literally risking death at sea to destroy the Seagate. To get real funding for our crumbling bridges, leftists will have to fight politically against the machinations of power to make culture see things our way. And the Revolutionary Squad do just that in this episode, successfully, despite initial struggles and complications, proving that leftists will win if they work hard and do it right. Princess Scorpia does not play a particularly large role in this episode, but we'll talk about her more later. For now, we're going to look at the last princess in the series, Princess Entrapta. In System Failure, we learn two things very quickly. Entrapta is a geek, and her careless advancements put her life and the lives of those around her in danger. Princess Entrapta is a much stronger example of the lumpen bourgeoisie than Princess Scorpia, so we'll talk about that here. The lumpen bourgeoisie are not those who necessarily use their power to oppress others, but they have no class consciousness and are often useful tools of capitalism and fascism. Geek culture is, unfortunately, filled with the lumpen bourgeoisie reactionaries that praise individuals like Elon Musk and Steve Jobs for their quote-unquote inventions while distancing themselves from socialism. In their minds, capitalism is the only system capable of producing more gadgets, more television, more games, and because of that, geeks often find themselves exploited by Silicon Valley, the AAA games industry, and Hollywood. Socialist policy does not prevent innovation, but only the rapid accumulation of resources can enable the creation of world-changing devices, good or bad. Capitalism is very good at churning innovators to death and selecting a few good businessmen who buy out the real inventors to take all the credit for their computers, their phones, their television programs, to concentrate the wealth in a small area to change the world. It is no wonder, then, that Entrapta both serves as the antagonist of this episode and the first season as a whole. The message of system failure, Princess Prom, No Princess Left Behind, The Beacon, Promise, Light Hope, and the Battle of Bright Moon is clear. The lumpen bourgeoisie are not to be trusted. They will work for the socialists and revolutionaries when the socialists offer them something convenient: universal basic income, healthcare free at the point of service, welfare, but will just as quickly betray the socialists when the whim strikes them. Capitalism has sunk its tenterhooks deep into their heart, and extraction will take them coming to terms with the excesses of capital, understanding class struggle, and a cultural push towards revolutionary ideology. In time, perhaps, masculine geek culture will begin to understand that what they hate aren't women or minorities, but the structures that ruin media, neoliberalism, and capitalism. In order to defeat that, a clear message untainted by neoliberal philosophy needs to shine brightly and clear any doubts they might have. Entrapta is not just a princess. She is symbolism for the more toxic geek community. There are many, many millennials who have been poisoned by endless neoliberal ideology and won over by fantastic gadgets and Marvel films, ignoring the danger they pose to their welfare and safety. This is not, I might add, unintentional. Neoliberalism is that process of co-opting values and turning them into more neoliberalism, like some virus that runs through ideologies, or the crystal that infects the machines in First One Tech in this episode. Neoliberal propaganda attempts to justify your actions first and explain them as the graces of capitalism. This isn't the only example of propaganda being used in the series either. In the Shadows of Mysticor is an episode that's ostensibly about abuse, but it's also relevant to the use of propaganda as a tool of neoliberalism. In the Shadows of Mysticor, The Beacon, and Promise, we get to delve a little deeper into the psyche of Adora and the fear of being isolated, as well as the role paranoia should play in socialist politics. The most important element of successful neoliberal propaganda is the division of the proletariat into individuals and the generation of fear. In this episode, Shadow Weaver attempts to alienate and separate Adora by feeding her images of rejection and fear, even going so far as to use Glimmer to reject Adora and Bow to inject her with fear. Adora has a strong dependence on her friends, especially considering that her best friend is gone and she has felt some level of isolation from her new community in the early stages of her enlistment. In fear of losing more friends, she clings tightly to her new beliefs and begins to become paranoid. This paranoia prevents her from resting, makes her carry her sword into the bath, and even destroy priceless artifacts, fighting against a mother only she can perceive. Her paranoia leads her to even more alienation from others reacting to her freakouts, and succeeds at isolating her even more than before. In a way, this paranoia also saves everyone. If she had not taken the precautions that she did and doubted what she saw, the whole of Mysticore would be in grave danger. In this way, the show argues, paranoia is healthy, and we are right to be paranoid and not doubt what we can see. Socialists would largely agree with this sentiment. Long has Bolshevism been a target of the reactionary community, and we learned firsthand what happened when we did not have a healthy dose of paranoia. The socialists of the 40s and 50s were like prophets, telling the capitalists that a bold economic shift would be needed to prevent the working class from falling into a state of disrepair. But the Red Scare destroyed their community, and their terrible prophecies came to pass. Now we stand at a modern crossroads, where a new Red Scare composed of anti-Chinese, anti-Russian, and anti-socialist resentment is brewing, and we would be naive to assume that our allies will stand by us as they spout words in the neoliberals' terms. They use the language of the racists and attempt to co-opt class struggles into quote-unquote democratic values. Footnote, that's a capital D democratic, and neither China nor Russia are communist. We need to develop paranoia that is healthy and historically accurate, and our queer and progressive brethren will understand if we couch our words in activist action. If we don't take action now, then maybe our ozone layer and our way of life will be the things vanishing, instead of Mysticore's invisibility barrier. This brings us to the next topic of sound advice the show gives us concerning tolerance in Princess Prom. There is an ongoing debate as to what tolerance means on the left, and there's a lot to be argued for tolerance being a word that the reactionaries use to infiltrate the public space. See, there's a difference between tolerating speech and enabling speech. In a scenario where one would tolerate speech, it would mean to allow discourse that runs counter to the narrative, as well as allowing critique of this discourse. If a debate is scheduled between a fascist and a socialist, it goes without saying that to block their speech is to be intolerant. Fascists, however, use this language of tolerance and intolerance to insert themselves into public spaces, ignoring the fact that their own intolerance would enable them to turn right around and block the socialists from speaking if they were given the opportunity. In this way, there runs a risk of intolerance being used as a cudgel for the right and the left. Intolerant societies oppress minorities, people of color, women, socialists, and the queer community. It's difficult to support intolerance without supporting the modus operandi of the fascists. But there's a vast gulf between tolerance and enabling speech. Enabling speech means not just to tolerate, but to encourage and platform speech. As leftists, we ought to show tolerance to the fascists, but not enable them to spread their vile message by putting boundaries in place for speech. This is easier said than done, and because it is difficult to monitor speech and prevent the enabling of fascist speech altogether, perhaps it is better to be intolerant. The complexity of this issue aside, Princess Prom does a rather good job of handling the debate of leftist tolerance and picks a very clear side. In the episode, this debate occurs by proxy between Adora, Catra, and Princess Frosta. Adora argues that the Horde should not be allowed to attend the Princess Prom because they are undoubtedly plotting something evil. To enable them to attend the prom means to allow whatever they are plotting to succeed. Catra, on the other hand, begs for tolerance, in the same way a fascist would in our reality. They even put a pretty bow on tolerance, promising not to abuse their attendance to cause harm to others. Hint, Catra is lying. But Frosta falls for the ruse and advocates as a liberal might, that they are permitted to attend the ball, but only if they remain peaceful. Frosta even goes so far as to threaten the revolutionary side with ejection instead, proving that she would rather side with the fascists who speak in her language than the socialists who preach intolerance. Something unthinkable to the liberal who has grown up knowing nothing of the threats posed by reactionaries. In the end, the episode once again proves Adora, who argued against tolerance, to be right. The Horde had indeed planned something nefarious, and the tolerance they were granted is used to perform a terrorist plot involving bombs and the kidnapping of Bo and Glimmer. This is an important choice of crime. The parallels between terrorism and tolerance are not insignificant, with fascist writings often being the obsession of terrorists before they commit their vile acts. While Princess Frosta does not come around until the season finale, it is clear that she was swayed by Adora's arguments and has decided to break her stance of neutrality in order to fight against the greater threat of the Horde. In this way, the show advocates that the left should not tolerate any reactionary thought or fascism and instead fight back in any way we can. No Princess Left Behind is probably my favorite episode of Season 1. The interplay between the princesses when they have all gathered is both amusing and insightful as to their personalities and their relationships. More broadly, however, this episode is a brief commentary on our modern prison system and, in Glimmer's case, what prison does to people after they are imprisoned. The episode begins by following the revolutionary team as they plot to destroy the prison holding the princesses Bo and Glimmer and bring them back to Bright Moon. And before you say anything, yes, I know Bo's not a princess, but he is, and you're wrong, so take that. While this episode does not make an explicit call to action, the symbolism of youth being thrown in prison is not lost on socialist and leftist thinkers. Many of the youth imprisoned in this country are put there by the neoliberals and the fascists, and the subtext of the revolutionary team breaking them free is the implication that the youth should do everything they can to abolish fascist prisons. She-Ra pulls together nearly all of the revolutionaries in her plan, outlining the difficulty and enormity of accomplishing this goal, and it is not without a loss in the form of Entrapta, who is swallowed by flames at the end of the episode. Well, she comes back, but more on that later. Another interesting detail within the episode is the use of torture and the impact it has on the prisoners. The prison system of the United States is modern, but only insofar as it has used some of the most cruel and inventive practices to create a system that breaks so-called criminals and ruins them emotionally and psychologically. Glimmer is left with a lasting scar after her torture at the hands of Shadow Weaver that lasts until the Battle of Bright Moon, one that disrupts her powers and causes her severe emotional distress. If Adora was not rescued in time, she would share a similar fate, only this time one where she was brainwashed into being loyal to the Horde. The message is clear. Fascists can and will use torture and the prison system to get what they want, and are not the least bit squeamish when they're tasked with torturing children. Even given these assertions by the subtext of the show, this is not to say that Bright Moon is not without their problems. Although it isn't shown in this episode and only mentioned indirectly in the Sword and Raz, Bright Moon almost certainly has a prison system and has likely also participated in torture. Unfortunately, it's difficult to judge the prison system of Bright Moon, as we have not seen that in universe, so we'll leave that as a topic for another time when we have more information. My money? It won't be painted in a good light either, based on what we know about Queen Angela. In The Beacon, Queen Angela returns for a surprise visit as the episode's antagonist. Again, after she nearly dismantled the revolution for the sake of Glimmer, She has now taken it upon herself to enjoy what moments she can with her daughter. Queen Angela has been shocked by the trauma of her husband's death, and she carries this trauma even now as her daughter nearly loses her life too. This does not spell good for the revolutionary forces. Now that their activities threaten her way of life, Queen Angela is beginning to regard the revolutionaries with stronger scrutiny and taking preemptive action, trying to isolate her daughter and speak to her in private. If you've been paying attention, you know why that's a bad thing in the context of this narrative. Thankfully, whatever cruel plans Queen Angela had were put on the back burner as her daughter's emotional scars come to light and she begins to glitch, a symptom of her trauma from her treatment in prison. At the same time, however, Catra has devised an isolated meeting of her own with Princess Entrapta, secured from the vents after she was left behind by the other princesses. It's almost like everyone's plan to radicalize princesses in this universe involves separating them from other princesses and trying to convert them to their side with propaganda. Catra uses this accidental abandonment and the fancy technology the Horde has created to both weaken and bribe Entrapta, and Entrapta takes the bait with glee. While Entrapta was a revolutionary, as mentioned earlier, she was susceptible to the wiles of capitalism. Add in a little neoliberal and fascist philosophy and offer her an alternative, a new reactionary community that will love her for who she is and approve of her every action. And you've got a recipe for an evil scientist now working for the Horde in exchange for First One tech. Adora and Catra both set off to learn more about the First Ones, although for different reasons, and we move to Promise. Promise does not offer us much we haven't already seen before, but it does delve deeper into the narrative of isolation and how it has corrupted Catra to increase her fascist tendencies. Catra has always been isolated from her community. Her mother, Shadow Weaver, openly abused her, and her comrades in arms reviled her as well. Perhaps it was because she was a different sexuality to them. It would not be out of place within this show that has a non-heteronormative cast in addition to its strong leftist bent. But for whatever reason, Catra has always grown in darkness alone. The only light in her world was Adora, and Adora abandoned her and everything their friendship stood for. The First Ones are not blind to this. Their technology chooses to focus on this aspect of her personality in the simulation, overwhelmingly over other memories they could have dragged up. While the reasoning for this is unknown, I offer a proposal, given the tendencies of the series. Light Hope wanted Adora to know about the true issue plaguing Catra, her solitude and loneliness. It is exposing her weakness to the administrator, attempting to exploit it for the cause of balance, and give Adora an opportunity to attack her where she was weakest, her heart. It would seem that not even Scorpia and Entrapta and Kyle formed friendly relationships with Catra, and she continues to suffer in silence until the day Adora comes back to her. But that's just an opinion, and our next episode comes with a fact. Light Hope is about climate change and the global disaster caused by neoliberalism and fascism. But first, let's talk about armchair socialism versus socialist activism and what Light Hope has to say about that. I understand the irony of an armchair socialist lampooning their own way of life, but Light Hope argues strongly against ivory tower education and for hands-on economic and political struggle instead. Light Hope is an artificial intelligence that manages the balance of the entire world of Etheria, and Adora is an agent of that balance. Light Hope is not an antagonist of the series, although she serves as the antagonist of her titular episode. She wants only what's best for Etheria, and wants to make sure Adora is prepared to handle any eventuality she might face. In this way, Light Hope is crafting political theory with some basis in history. She's been inside Etheria for longer than anyone else, but she is advocating for inaction until a perfect solution is reached, something Adora argues they don't have time for. Sometimes it's a matter of action first and theory later, and in this particular case, there's no time for perfection. The Horde's threat to the world is imminent, Adora argues, and how right she is. On the surface, Glimmer and Bow are approached by Swift Wind, a talking alicorn that freaks everybody out. It's cute, but Swift Wind is a character that lends further credence to the idea that the writers may have socialist or leftist policies. Swift Wind speaks of the liberation of other animals like himself, and proposes to help find Adora to deal with the looming climate crisis. The Horde has finally done it, creating a wave of energy that is destabilizing the world. Climate conditions are worsening, freezing over the Whispering Woods and causing untold damage to other members of the rebellion as storms and billows rock their kingdoms. These are the same effects we'd expect to see and are seeing from climate change in our time. Normally warm areas are becoming colder, cold areas are becoming warmer, and storms are becoming more intense across the board. No scientist worth their salt would tell you otherwise. In both the real world and in the world of Eternia, these disasters are clearly man-made. In She-Ra, by Princess Entrapta, and in our world through a variety of complex interworking factors of pollution and capitalism. Them's the breaks. The only hope is to reinforce the crystals and to bring balance, and She-Ra cannot balance the world when she is in a First One outpost listening to an old woman ramble about training more instead of fighting the threat of now. Her friends rescue her, but she's too late to stop the advance of the Horde troop, led by Entrapta's enhanced murder drones and Catra's army, and the curtains rise on the war in the Battle of Bright Moon. Much like the Battle of Bright Moon, the fascists win when the left, the workers, the socialists do not show solidarity with one another. Even the neoliberals can be convinced to support us if their own interests are at stake, and while I would not personally trust them, the show advances that they can be useful tools. Queen Angela defends Bright Moon's crystal while She-Ra, Glimmer, and Bow attempt to fight the Horde, but their combined strength is not enough. It is not until the arrival of Frosta, Mermista, and Perfuma that the tides of battle are finally turned and time is brought for balance to be restored again. Radical action is taken to restore the climate using all the effort of united rebellion, and the fascists are destroyed where they stand and sent back licking their woods. All seems good. For now. This is where Season 1 ends, but the revolution is not over by a long shot. A few wins does not a victory make, and the series promises to continue into the future for as long as we know. But I would be remiss not to acknowledge one of the producers of the show in the problems of using leftist thought in a neoliberal think space. To close out today's thoughts, let's talk about Mattel. Mattel Creations, a subsidiary of Mattel Inc., is one of the top earning toy companies in the world. As soon as 2013, Mattel has been involved in labor abuse of Chinese citizens and has committed massive labor theft on an industrial scale. That makes sense, given that it is consistently in the top 500 companies when going by stock prices. Mattel has issued a public apology in the form of their modern slavery statement since 2016 and has promised to be better on the issue, but companies are amoral machines and should be held to much higher standards than words on paper. More worrying is the new CEO of Mattel, Ynon Kreiz. Kreiz is your typical bourgeoisie fascist, and that should worry you. Kreiz is partnered with Rupert Murdoch, controlled Endemol, held large stakes in Balderton Capital, Warner Music Group, and was the CEO of Maker Studios during some of their worst excesses. If you don't know what an MCN is, and especially what Maker Studios is, know that he is a scammer. Ynon Kreiz has worked with fascists. He has worked with capitalists. He has worked with criminals, copyright trolls, and scam artists. And now, he is the one in charge of the second largest toy company and an entire network of children's programming. If that doesn't worry you, I don't know what will. Alright, thank you all for listening to the first episode of Socialist Salad. Special thanks to Emotional Support Dino, who helped me find all this pretty screen caps I've been putting up this whole time, and Erixperience, our editor, for the thumbnail and some audio engineering. They would have edited the episode, but they were busy and they didn't. You got me instead, chumps. Anyways, onto the value extraction portion of the video. If you like what you see and want to hear more about She-Ra and different political movements, you should subscribe and or click that bell thingy. If you like to feed poor people, you can go donate to my Ko-fi or Doctors Without Borders, pretty much the only charity that isn't a total scam. I'm hoping to do some videos with higher production budgets, especially for this Notch video I've been researching for a while now. Dude's fucked up.